Hi there, I just thought I'd run through how I go about editing one photo. So you'll see initially I was in Lightroom and I've already down selected the photos. So for this one finished image, there's 9 different photos that I'm using to create that one finished image. So the first thing I do is bring the photos into Lightroom. And whilst those load, so within the 9 images, there'll be some ambient exposures, sort of different exposures, so some bright, some darker, to account for sort of dark shadows and the windows and getting in the sky. And there'll be a couple which have flash as well. So once they're in Photoshop, the first thing I'll do is just make sure they're all aligned properly. So even when you're taking photos on a tripod, there could be some micro movements, so you just want to make sure that all the photos are properly aligned. And then what I'm doing is looking at which exposure I want to use as the base ambient exposure. So that needs to be somewhere that's got enough detail in it, but there may be some highlights that are still blown out that are pure white, and there may be some dark shadows as well. And then what I'm doing is also finding the flash frames I want to use. And then what I do is, you see, moving the layers around, is putting the ambient layer above the flash layer, and then changing the blending mode in Photoshop to luminosity. And what that means is, for the ambient layer, it's just bringing across the lightness of that photo, not the colour. So the colour is coming from the flash layer below. But because the opacity of that ambient layer is 100%, I'm bringing that down, which is then sort of bringing through some of the flash layer below it. So once I've done that, I'm now looking at another layer that's slightly darker, because there's certain areas, so like the column in the centre and obviously the window surrounds, that are a bit too bright. So I'll then put a black mask on, and what that means is that there's nothing currently showing from that photo. So I'm then using things called luminosity masks, and that allows me to just select the brightest areas of the photo, and then that sort of creates a selection, and then I use a brush essentially in Photoshop to brush back in some of those darker areas from that darker image. So with these, you need to be a bit careful, because it can get a bit funky if you use too much of a selection. So again, it's all just about subtle changes, and you can see from the mask kind of how much of it I'm bringing back, and you'll see there that sort of I thought that the side of the column was a bit dark, so I'm now sort of reversing the brush and removing a bit of that darker layer from that one. And what I've done there is actually add a layer that adds a bit of orange to that darker area. When you bring back darker exposures, they can be a bit grey and a bit muddy, so adding a bit of orange just helps kind of bring a bit of life back into that. So I've now got a slightly darker image again, and I'm using a slightly different technique. So you can see I'm using a quick select tool, because the sort of area I want to make dark is quite easy for Photoshop to find. So creating an area by selection, and then again using a soft brush just to bring back as much of that darker area that I want to. So especially around sort of the veluxes, just making sure that the frames and the areas around those is as dark as I want them to be. So then I've got this one which is exposed basically for the view, which is the sky in this case, and again using a similar technique just to bring back that sky. So on this day, there was a blue sky outside, so I could use a shot that I actually took on that day. But quite often I will replace the sky with a different selection of clouds and skies that I have in my stock library. So again, it's just sort of brushing it back in, and then you'll see at some point I use a brush just to make sure that it hasn't sort of spilled over onto the edge of the windows, just to sort of make sure there's no blue within that bit. So what I do then is actually sort of boost the blues against those sort of skies, just to make sure that the skies kind of pop a little bit more. So once I'm happy that I've blended all the layers together as much as I want, I then sort of flatten the image down to one layer, and then I have a standard setting that just kind of amends the image and just does some tweaks. What am I doing here? Oh yeah, and then I have an action that basically removes pretty much most of the blues. So quite often, especially around windows, you get a sort of a blue color cast, and it doesn't look that attractive. So I use an action to remove all of the blue, and then I'm using a brush here to paint back in the blue where I want it to be blue. So with removing that blue, you need to be careful that you don't do it too much, because it can look a little bit stark and unrealistic. So again, it's just a subtle change to that. So there I'm just kind of testing it just to make sure I'm happy and there's no other areas that I've missed when I've brushed it out, just to make sure I'm brushing it all back in. What am I going to do next? I can't remember. Great. So once I'm happy in Photoshop, I then bring it back into Lightroom. And then what I do is just a sort of final little tweaks, which kind of reduces the highlights, increases the contrast just a little bit, increases the shadows just a little bit. So all just fairly minor stuff. So the next key thing here is just to make sure that the verticals are vertical. So I'm using a tool here where you can just sort of align it against things that should be upright. So you can see that makes a small adjustment. And then I just recrop it back to a 3:2 aspect ratio and just bring in the crop just a little bit. And then finally, I'm just doing a final check on the white balance, just to make sure it's where it should be. So if you've got this far in the video, firstly, thank you and well done. I thought it'd be worth just touching on style and the style of photos. So for instance, this photo was for a holiday let, and the style of the property had nice sort of crisp white walls and deep coloured furniture. So I really wanted to accentuate that within the edit. So for different clients, be it developers or holiday lets, or interior designers, architects, I'll be very conscious about the purpose of the photos when I'm taking and editing the photos. So you'll see some examples of different photos I've taken with different editing styles, just to try and meet the ideal requirements of the clients. So I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you again soon. Okay, cheers, bye.